They were landing on the beaches, and I could hear it. I could hear it all. You suddenly thought, this is a war. I really had the war in my ears.
We had responsible jobs at a very young age, like 19, 18 years old, and we did feel good about the fact we could contribute.
Civilians and service people got together, helped one another.
You couldn't look far into the future. He might only have had a fortnight's leave, and then he'd be killed at the end of it. You had no idea what was going to happen, so you would just put up with it. The advertisement said to join the Wrens so that you could free a sailor to go to sea, meaning that obviously a lot of the work the men did could be done by girls. And so that was how it started. When I got to Belfast, I found that our headquarters was in the Belfast Castle above the river, and we could see ships coming in and out, and sometimes they sent ships who'd been in the Atlantic to be repaired in our dockyard. Meanwhile, we Wrens ran the plot up in Belfast and had the whole the west coast and particularly the whole Atlantic in a plot on the wall. And one day I was watching the ships come in from our castle office, and I saw a ship, a destroyer coming in, HMS Orrery she was called, and she had been involved in various battles in the Atlantic and needed some repairs. So she had her repairs done in Belfast, and so their first opportunity, the first thing the Wrens did on their arrival was to send a message to the wardroom asking us down to have a drink on board. They had their priorities obviously right, so we, half a dozen of us, went down to have a drink on board, and there I met John Lamb, my future husband, and in 10 days we decided to get married. The next morning they sailed off to join this convoy which was leaving just north of Belfast. They were absolutely vital, because at the moment we were unable to feed ourselves. We had the most terrible rationing. I mean, rationing wasn't bad for Wrens because we had some naval stores, but for ordinary people they would have 1 egg a fortnight. I mean, can you imagine anything more awful? And so meat and everything was very, very difficult to get. The first bit of the Atlantic, we were able to give them air cover from our side, and then there was a huge gap before more air cover could be given from the Canadian side. So as we approached the centre, the gap as it was called, there they had about 40 U-boats were waiting for them to attack them, and they managed to sink about 12 of our ships before we got anything back. At this point, HMS Orrery was one of the part of the escort of this convoy, and the battle went on. We had signals which were repeated to us, and anything which told us what was going on. I knew that they were in this involved in this terrible battle, and I had thought, having just managed to catch hold of this man, I'm now going to let him go. But of course, no, actually we were plotting. We knew the battle was going on. We didn't have information as we would have liked it, but we had a certain amount of information that came in and told us what was going on. John had been in bed, lying in a place near the bridge. He was woken up by a terrific crash, which actually he didn't know what it meant. He got out of bed and rushed up to the bridge again, only to find that his ship, HMS Orrery, had rammed a U-boat, and they had actually were now sort of riding on the side of the ship. It was the most extraordinary state to be in. Of course, it was terrible anxiety, and all my friends tried to persuade me to go back and not to pay attention. But I couldn't possibly leave the scene. It was a matter of complete life or death to me, and I stayed there waiting for information, hoping for information, and just waiting, hopefully. And luckily, eventually, we'd had more information to say that they had actually managed to sink to this U-boat, and on their way back, they were able to crawl back to Canada this time. They were the other side of the Atlantic, and so they managed to get back at about 12 knots, which was a sort of safe speed they could go at. When eventually he arrived in Canada, he was able to ring me up and say he'd arrived safely. Well, it was amazing, of course, and you know, we just both felt, well, there's nothing you could say. Just thank goodness, thank goodness, thank goodness. You know, that's all you could do. You couldn't look far into the future. You might only have had a fortnight's leave, and then he'd be killed at the end of it. You had no idea what was going to happen. So you just put up with it, and if something was there, at the present, it was there, you did it, whatever.
I grew up in the countryside in Lancashire, in my grandfather's house. He had a refugee cook from Austria and a refugee housemaid, and when they came, they didn't speak any English. He gave me a small German dictionary, so I used to spend my evenings as a schoolgirl sitting with Mrs. Getzel. It meant that we were talking more in German than English. I've never found languages a problem. In fact, German turned out to be a rather useful language to have during the war. We trained at Mill Hill and Wimbledon, and then we were sent to little coastal listening stations. My first station was on the Yorkshire coast at a place called Withernsea, because we had very good reception from the Baltic, and the German naval ships used to talk coming out of the Baltic or leaving their bases in the Baltic. And at Withernsea, we used to search their wavelengths, write down everything we heard. They kept radio silence most of the time, but we were searching up and down their radio frequencies in our little secret stations. And I think we probably got a fair amount of useful information. And we passed the coded messages to Bletchley Park and the plain language messages to the nearest Naval Intelligence Centre. They'd sometimes have a bit of chat, you know, did you know so-and-so's boat are all going on leave next week? And the one who picked it up said, oh, sie machen alle Kinder was? You know, they're all going to make babies. And even things like that we wrote down, because the rule was that everything you heard, you logged. And it might even be useful for our side to know that these crews were going on leave, that those boats would not be operating. Even bits of gossip like that could come in useful. So we wrote everything down. I was transferred to a station between Dover and Folkestone, where we could hear very loud and clear German naval ships warming up in the harbours opposite or going down the channel. Well, we worked what we called watches, which would be called shifts. So many hours on, 4 hours on, 8 hours off, that sort of thing. I'd been on watch overnight. I came out in the morning, about 8 o'clock, and there was a party of people coming up the path towards our cliff. And I recognised in the middle of this group Winston Churchill and General Eisenhower, and they were with a group of officers, and you were supposed to salute people of that rank, but as I'd been on duty all night and was just informally dressed, all I could do was wave and say, "Good morning," and so they all waved back and said, "Good morning," and they went on their way to the edge of our cliff. And in fact, much later on, I heard that Churchill wanted it to be reported back that he and Eisenhower had been down on the Kent coast to deceive the Germans into thinking the landings were going to be in Kent, into the Calais area, whereas, of course, we were going to land much further west in Normandy. That ploy worked.
I went in early 41. I went to Devizes to learn gunnery, as it was called. I was a height finder plotter. When the German aircraft came across, now the height finder was 9 foot long, about that fat round, and it was on a plinth, which you moved it around. You followed the aircraft. And I had one like that, very similar, that had cutouts for my 4 fingers. And I looked in to 2 strong scopes, metal round there, and magnifiers in there. I could use that eye, or both. The girl that was next to me, who became my mate, she turned a wheel and she looked into one scope, and she had to get any part of the aircraft as fast as she could onto that line and keep it there. Whereas I had 2 aircraft, a line and 2 aircraft, one right way up, one wrong way up. And as soon as you got them level, whatever part you was on, whether it was tail fin, tail plane, nose, whatever, you had to work fast. Then you called to the number 1 on target, and she would read out the figures. So I was doing height, the other girl was doing range. She was calling out figures. That went to the guns in big pipes. So remember, we're walking over them pipes, not treading on them, walking over them, sometimes almost falling over. That was our job.
So I applied to join the Wrens in March 1944. And when I told them that I was a GPO trained switchboard operator, I could tell more or less that I'd be accepted. Portsmouth in April 1944 was a hive of activity. But The thing is, Fort Southwark, which was our working place, was a very secret communication centre, dug deep into tunnels in the cliffs overlooking Portsmouth Harbour. But to get down into the tunnels, we had to go down 350 steps. We had to sleep in the tunnels, eat in the tunnels, be on duty in the tunnels. And of course, when we were coming off shift, we had to come up 350 steps. So it was a good thing we were young and fit. The amount of activity in the tunnels, I mean, each tunnel contained a branch of communications. 2 months before D-Day, I was given training on this VHF set, which was a small radio set. And I think VHF then was in its infancy. It was simple for us to operate. You merely had to operate the levers up or down. As it was a one-way system, I would pass whatever messages I had to, and then they would lift their lever and pass their responses. And it was when they lifted their lever that I realised I was listening to warfare, because they were landing on the beaches and I could hear it. I could hear it all. Gunfire, machine guns, cannon, screaming, men shouting, orders being shouted, all manner of things. You suddenly thought, this is a war. I really had the war in my ears. And it made me very much aware of what was at stake. So, you know, I think it taught me a lesson about war, although I was a non-combatant, of course. Nevertheless, I heard war at a very, very close source, because not only did I have that experience on D-Day, but I'd lived through the Blitz as well.
Early in the enemy's intensified air attacks on London, bombs were dropped on the Dockland area.
And I can vividly remember the night they blitzed the docks. The whole of Dockland was alight, and you could see from the sky, the whole sky was red. We had to go down to the tube station at Clapham North, because that was the only really effective shelter you could find. I think we all really were terrified. So I knew what bombing was like, to be the other end of the bombing, you know, the recipient of it. So no, for me, war is something that should be avoided at all costs. We were told that there would be an official photographer coming down to the tunnels. So I had somebody I knew in the tunnels, a young sailor, and I asked him if I could borrow his white top, you know, with the navy beading across. I'm now sure that if it were known by the officers that this is what I planned to do, it would have been frowned upon very definitely. But I went ahead, nobody knew, and so my photograph exists of a wren hat at a rather perky angle, and a white top that I shouldn't have been wearing. King George VI came down to visit us all in the fort. He toured a lot of the tunnels. I think there was a lift for VIPs. Don't think he had to traverse 350 steps. However, on the parade ground, he took the salute and we all marched past. And at the end, he thanked us all for our contribution to the effort, to the war effort. That was a moment of great pride. The Wrens couldn't march wonderfully well because we weren't required to do so. So I only hope we kept in step. When I heard that the war was over, we were all overjoyed. And for me, it meant demobilisation. So I came down to London and was demobbed in August 1946. So it wasn't a long service, but an eventful one. And for me, it was probably the most meaningful episode of my life.